Okay, so this is our second section of readings from Tuesdays with Morrie, and it's chapters 5 through 10. And first of all, I'd like to say that I'm glad that you're all enjoying the book. I know it's a quick read. Try to stick to the chapters or reread the chapters as we discuss them so that your focus will be on the specific chapters that we cover. And I really like the insights that you had. I'd like to hear if you have any different insights than I had, if any sections of the book struck you or had meaning for you that I didn't mention. I just like to hear people's personal views that may bring out things that I didn't see. And let's begin with this chapter. It's called The Classroom. And on page 33, I underlined a couple words, the siren song of my own life. And in that paragraph he writes, I had no good excuse for this except the one that everyone else these days seems to have. I had become too wrapped up in the siren song of my own life. I was busy. And that word busy, just busyness during this season, during the end of a semester, taking this online class. It's always a lot in our lives. But then I wrote, too much self, not enough other. So it's one thing to be busy in the present, in presence of other, being present for another. When I was a school counselor, or a counselor in clinical mental health, and when I worked with people, and when I was present for them in a session, time flew. It was emotionally draining because I was doing my best to be empathic and to be present for them. But I lost track of time. I wasn't immersed in self other than perhaps what I learned about myself while trying to help my client as well. And so that's one kind of busy. And that's an immersion in the presence. And I think that's positive, especially when it's with our loved ones or people that we are helping. But when it has to do with self, when our time is being consumed with matters of self, matters of goals that might not be contributing to meaning, to material goods or the acquiring of material goods, things like that. Those are just a few examples. But when we look back on the day and we say, if this was our last day, is this how we would have liked to spend it? So I guess that's what I got from this paragraph. It starts, when I first read this years ago, it started to help me reflect on what busyness or being busy meant in my own life. Sometimes it was positive, but sometimes it was consuming the time in an unhealthy way or in an unmeaningful way. And when we think about it, time is really our most valuable commodity in life. It's our most valuable possession. We get to choose how we spend that time. On the next page, it begins to talk about time. I squirmed, wanting to show I had been grappling deeply with these questions. What happened to me? Once promised myself I would never work for money, that I would join the Peace Corps, that I would live in beautiful, inspirational places. Instead, I had been in Detroit for 10 years now, the same workplace, using the same bank, visiting the same barber. I was 37, more efficient than in college, tied to computers and modems and cell phones, wrote articles about rich athletes who, for the most part, could not care less about people like me. I was no longer young for my peer group, nor did I walk around in gray sweatshirts with unlit cigarettes in my mouth. Did not have long discussions over egg salad sandwiches about the meaning of life. My days were full, yet I remained, much of the time, unsatisfied. Then I wrote, peace. What does that entail? Finding satisfaction, fulfillment, all leading to personal meaning in our lives. On the next page, what about our culture makes us feel unhappy or not good about ourselves? He talks a lot about culture, and culture we have does not make people feel good about themselves. We're teaching the wrong things. And you have to be strong enough to say, if the culture doesn't work, don't buy it. Create your own. Most people can't do it. They're more unhappy than me, even in my current condition. What is it about our culture that may promote things that are not truly fulfilling, truly meaningful? Does it have to do with the disposability of things, the limited lifespan of not only people but objects, the acquiring of material things rather than meaning and fulfillment, receiving or getting rather than giving? I don't know, all of these things are kind of philosophical things, but think about what it is about American culture that may be positive and promote fulfillment, and what is it about culture that may be negative and not promote self-fulfillment or promote dissatisfaction. So there's a lot in this chapter that really made me think. And on the last page, on 38, he said, I promised I would. He said, come back, see your old professor. Hugged him goodbye. I promised I would, and I tried not to think about the last time I promised this. We make a lot of promises that sometimes we fulfill, sometimes we don't. And they lead to regrets if we do not fulfill certain things or meet certain expectations, especially our own. And next week we'll begin talking about the regret model and how to treat that. In the next chapter, in the italics, talks about youth, identity, and crisis, I and thou, and the divided self. 3 of my favorite books, and I'd recommend reading them. So Erickson wrote Youth, Identity, and Crisis, and he talks about the stages of development, but also he was the first person to take stage theory throughout the lifespan. So not only is it the stages of development, it's Erickson's view, the stages of life. What gives each stage meaning and fulfillment? Buber's I and thou, me and you. In the next video of this module, I'm going to talk about Martin Buber and how it fits my personal philosophy of life, meaning, death, grief, and loss. And R.D. Laing, The Divided Self. Let's see. All of these are excellent things. He talks about, have I told you about the tension of opposites, he says. Life is a series of poles back and forth. Buddhism would call it yin and yang. You want to do one thing, but you're bound to do something else. Something hurts you, yet you know it shouldn't. You take certain things for granted, even when you know you should never take anything for granted. A tension of opposites, like a pull on a rubber band, Most of us live somewhere in the middle. So the last sentence is, which side wins? He smiles at me, crinkled eyes, crooked teeth. Love wins. Love always wins. Part of my philosophy is that there are so many different deep issues in counseling that we need to address. But ultimately, most of our decisions are the result of either love or fear. And if it's the result of fear, it could be fear of the unknown, fear of financial instability, fear of being alone. But all of these fears are somewhat irrational when the opposite is love, a loving response, authenticity, genuineness, unconditional positive regard, all of those things, accurate empathic understanding. Those, if we look at our own responses and ask ourselves, is this a response in fear or a response in love? And that could help us reframe our perception of experiences and actions. Taking attendance, the next chapter. The first page of that chapter he wrote, but for now, for some reason I found myself thinking about Morrie whenever I read anything silly or mindless. And I wrote perspective. But with perspective, does life then always have to be serious? Not really. So even though we're talking about all of these heavy topics, it's very important maybe not to take ourselves so seriously. One of the greatest virtues is to be able to laugh at ourselves, at our mistakes. It's part of being human. It's part of how we learn to live better. Page 43, the italics there. So many people walk around with a meaningless life. They seem half asleep. He goes on to talk, and all of this that he's talking about is the essence of counseling theory from Rogers, Gestalt theory with Pearls, Adlerian, and existential theory. And just because I'm so connected with counseling theory, that really stands out to me, the connection between our profession and what he's saying there. Then on page 45, so I had grown used to thinking readers somehow needed my column. I was stunned how easily things went on without me. So when Mitch Albom is not writing his column, he takes a break, it's very similar to Morrie's feeling after hearing about his diagnosis. And yet, Morrie's diagnosis is about life and death. Mitch Albom's realization is just about his work. I wrote down in the italics I circled, he tells me I need to be fully human. He speaks of the alienation of youth, the need for connectedness with the society around me. And that's really what Rogers is talking about in his person-centered theory. The first Tuesday we talk about the world. And on page 49, he asked about the newspaper strike, and true to form, he couldn't understand why both sides didn't simply communicate with each other, solve their problems. And I told him not everyone was as smart as he was. But really it's about greed and capitalism, all of that good stuff in our society. So then on page 50, he writes, he sighed, maybe you're right, maybe I shouldn't care after all. Won't be around to see how it all turns out. But it's hard to explain, Mitch. Now that I'm suffering, I feel closer to people who suffer than I ever did before. And that's empathy. That's true empathy. I often tried to be empathic with my clients. And I really was not seeing the full picture. I thought I was doing a good job until I experienced some of the issues that the clients experienced. So for instance, when I experienced a number of losses in my life, to truly move through that grief and loss experience, or to feel some depression with complicated grieving, then I gained true insight into what they may be experiencing, and it was far deeper than I had believed. So that empathy through experience is such a valuable thing. Page 51, he writes, "Is this what comes at the end? I wondered. Maybe death is the great equalizer, the one thing that can finally make strangers shed a tear for one another." Page 52, "The most important thing in life is to learn how to give out love, how to let it come in." His voice dropped to a whisper. "Let it come in. We think we don't deserve love. We think if we let it in we'll be too soft. But a wise man named Levine said it right. He said, love is the only rational act. To love and to be loved. Sometimes it's easier to love than to allow ourselves to allow ourselves to be loved, to accept that love. It's really tied very closely with, in order to truly love, to truly be loved, we have to allow ourselves to become vulnerable. And that's a very risky thing, because if we allow ourselves to become vulnerable, we allow ourselves to trust. If we allow ourselves to trust, it opens ourselves to the possibility of being hurt in some way. And we've learned to build up walls and defenses, and to not allow ourselves to fully love or to fully be loved. So it's a scary thing to live and to love. One of the other things he writes in the italics is, on page 53, silence among and within. The second Tuesday, we talk about feeling sorry for yourself. Before my third visit, I stopped at a market called Bread and Circus. And just think that's interesting. The monarchy in France said people were ready to have a revolution. And he said, just give them bread and circus, and they will be satisfied. Do we feel sorry for ourselves? Cheated in some way? And how does that affect the way we respond and live? If we feel sorry for ourselves or cheated in some way, then we remain self-centered and introspective rather than truly experiencing others. At the end of the italics on 61, I wrote, so I told this story about using counseling skills at a garage, and something wrong with a new car, and I had brought it in 3 times. They're like, I'm sorry, you're just going to have to contact Nissan, can't help you anymore. And prior to my master's degree in counseling, I would have gotten angry because I would have become defensive and felt helpless and felt that I had to force this issue. But instead, I simply said, this is my first new car, and I'm feeling helpless here. How would you feel if you were me going through this exact problem? And he said, you're right. He took the car back and fixed it. So Only use these counseling skills for good. Let's see, the third Tuesday, we talk about regrets. And this chapter is very important, and it connects with my chapter on regret theory and regret therapy. And on page 63 he writes, his voice dropped to a whisper, "I want someone to hear my story. Will you?" And I've said something very similar to many clients who are experiencing a terminal illness or who are at the end of their life. They had regrets. We process those, and we'll talk about how to do that in detail. But many times they wanted somebody to hear their story, and they wanted to help somebody. They wanted to share what they have learned, what they have experienced. And the only thing I could say is that I'm here. I will listen to your story, and it will have meaning in my life. So I listened to someone's story. All of our lives are stories. All of our lives are adventures. Underlined a few things on 64. We're so wrapped up with egotistical things, career, family, having enough money, meeting the mortgage, getting a new car, fixing the radiator when it breaks. We're involved in trillions. Is this all? Is this all I want? Is something missing? It says, take care of your inner child. Page 66, I wrote, what would you add to this list? He said, ask me anything, Morrie always said. So I wrote this list. I wanted to ask him about death and fear and aging and greed and marriage, society and forgiveness and a meaningful life. What would you add to that list? I added the word happiness. As I've grown older, when I was younger, I was a seeker. Thought I would travel, have adventures, and find the meaning of life. And yet it was only much later in life, when I settled down and had a family, experienced clients and children and teaching, that I knew meaning was always within my grasp. I didn't have to travel anywhere. It's where I was. And that's my notes on this segment of Tuesdays with Morrie. Let me know what your thoughts are. And I really enjoyed reading your posts last week.